Hello, once again. This is part 3 of our series on the approaches to psychology. You should already have watched my video on the biological approach and the evolutionary approach. And for this video, we are going to dive into the psychodynamic approach. We are going to take a very shallow look at this so far. The theory and the foundations behind it have so much more to them that we will explore on later units. But as we're introducing the approaches, I just wanted to establish what the basic guidelines are when we talk about something in the psychodynamic point of view. So if we cut straight to it, in the timeline of psychology's history, we discussed how Sigmund Freud came in as a major player in making the general public more aware of psychology, but he did so by taking a very different approach than a lot of the other thinkers at the time. And the major approach of the psychodynamic thinkers is that your behaviors and mental processes occur because of what's going on in your unconscious. So the whole concept underlying the psychodynamic approach is that you aren't really aware of what's going on inside your brain at any given time. You are getting the little tip of the iceberg on what your brain is allowing you to be able to understand, but it is intentionally blocking out most of the actual processes that are happening, leading you to the mental processes and the behaviors that you are aware of. So this iceberg analogy is used a lot. So you can see the waves of the tip of the iceberg above that are your conscious thoughts. Those are the things that you're aware of. There's a few things that you can become aware of if you start to think back, like some of your memories. But that line between the preconscious and the unconscious on your screen is a very firm line that you are not meant to see below, because of those things that are being hidden from you are dark and hurtful, and we don't want to know those things are going on in our mind. So the root of the psychodynamic approach is that everything is an expression of these unconscious drives and conflicts that you may not even be aware are happening within your own mind, much less somebody else's. However, when you start to see the perspective, they start to become more visible when you can look for some of the signs of these things. So I'm going to give you basically 2 foundational pieces that can lead to these unconscious drives and conflicts. Both of them relate into child development. And so Sigmund Freud and his developmental theories become a much bigger place in our developmental unit. However, the core of this theory is that when you're born, you have this immediate force that wants everything right now. It is unfeeling. It doesn't care about consequences. And this force doesn't really have any sense of what we would consider morals. The psychodynamic approach refers to this as your id, and you spell that just ID. So your id is impulsive and it is willing to get what it wants at any cost. And you should kind of picture the id as a 1-year-old in a constant state of a temper tantrum that wants what it wants, and it's not old enough yet to understand that you can't get everything you want all the time. Ultimately, it has its opponent, the superego, which develops much later, and the superego is a force that is the conscience. That's that voice inside your head that is telling you the difference between right and wrong. It can make you feel guilty when you make a bad choice, and it can remind you of those core moral principles that you want to live by when you're making any sort of decision. Balancing those 2 forces out, we have a force called the ego, and it is grounded on making decisions that are going to be okay in our real world, while giving the id and the superego both a little bit of what they need. And so Freud will say there are no accidents. Every behavior or mental process you have is a result of this conflict going on between your id and your superego, and how the ego can bring those 2 sides together to allow something to happen. So if you have ever had an accident that maybe manifested itself as an aggression against somebody else. Maybe you bumped into somebody too hard in the hallway and they fell down. The psychodynamic approach is going to say, that was not an accident at all. Your id had some anger and rage towards that person you bumped into. You can't go attack them because that's not how society works, and you get severely punished. Your superego knows that that person didn't do anything to deserve getting punished either. So the ego's compromise, allowing the id to express its aggression while the superego is also trying to allow your morals to come through, is you bumped into that person hard enough that they fell down and you feel guilty about it and you apologize. So your id is sitting there like screaming in celebration that you finally were able to take out some anger against that person. And your superego is making you feel bad for this same action that your id is largely responsible for. And so we are constantly juggling these unconscious forces. So that is one root of our behaviors and mental processes. The other comes down to unresolved childhood development issues. And so that is a whole can of worms we're not willing to open yet. But know that Freud will say that a lot of your struggles are based out of your childhood and those struggling through those different phases of development in childhood. And those can manifest themselves throughout your entire life if you had any sorts of issues resolving some of those issues. And so we will continue to explore those a lot later on. For our purposes now, I'm going to bring us back to our guy who is wrestling his grizzly bear. So we ask you once again, according to the psychodynamic approach, why is he wrestling this grizzly bear? And once again, I'm going to ask you to pause this video and answer that question first before you hear some of the common responses. So go ahead and pause. So there is one key phrase you should check your answers for immediately. Did you talk about the unconscious? If you involved a sort of conscious mental awareness, we should probably go back and revisit that answer. Because if you were not dealing with the unconscious forces that are involved in this decision, we're missing the point of this. And that's a common error. Don't feel bad, but pause this again and give it another shot. If your answer does involve the unconscious, what we should be hearing is some sort of extremely impulsive and most likely aggressive drive coming from the id. So maybe this guy has some sort of aggression that he has a childhood issue where the bears scared him as a kid when he went on his elementary school field trip to the zoo. And now he's older, but his id is still screaming to make up for that experience as a child. And so his id has this aggression towards the bear and is desperately trying to go out and hurt bears in whatever way we can. Now, when we look at this in the terms of reality, he's probably not really going to hurt the bear. And this is probably a trained bear in some sort of audience participation. So this would allow his id to still feel like it's acting aggressively towards the bear, while his superego knows that no one's actually getting hurt here. And that if anything, you're more likely to get hurt for attempting to interact with this. And so the ego is allowing the bear to be safe while also releasing some of that aggression against it. We also know as another potential answer, there's a lot of childhood issues that could be going on here. And if you are familiar at all with Freudian theory, one of the angles that he would consider going through this would be maybe having a larger, more powerful figure as reminding this guy of his aggression towards his dad as a child. And maybe he's going and taking out his childhood issues against his dad while hoping to, on an unconscious level, regain the respect and love from his mother in this process. So again, I'm hinting at some deeper issues that we'll be exploring a lot later on. But the core we need to make sure our answers always have is this is going on in the unconscious level. This guy does not have a reason that he can articulate that would be the same as the psychodynamic reason. He'll tell you something, but he's only going to tell you what the ego is telling him, not the forces that are influencing the ego to get there in the first place. So this concludes our video on the psychodynamic approach. As always, if you have additional questions or concerns, or if you had a different type of answer and you want me to see if that seems like it's on par for the psychodynamic approach, feel free to run that by with me. And feel free to move on to our next approaches video.